world, but the primary meaning is to struggle within oneself. And it's quite appropriate, for example, that we end a day of fasting on Ramadan and begin the iftar meal with a date, the tradition of which we are told goes back to the Prophet Muhammad himself. Because if you think about a date, aside from its role within a desert-like environment, such that it is the most readily available food one may be likely to find in the area of an oasis, it is also one of those foods which, if its juices are distilled and fermented, becomes the object of what you are told you should not be indulging in. It's not that you can't drink wine or whiskey, because wine or whiskey, as we understand those in a Euro-American context, don't exist in the part of the world from which Muhammad came. It was dates. It was fermented dates. So the date has the potential to be that from which you should stay away, or to be that with which you break your fast as you enter into the feasting of the evening during Ramadan. It is all about possibilities. It's all about struggling within ourselves, disciplining ourselves to make ourselves better people than we might otherwise be. Of course, that is what Ramadan is all about. It's about fasting, and fasting is a human discipline. It's one of the ways in which, as a species, we show ourselves to be different from the other species, the other animals, who eat when there's food available, who eat until food is no longer available, who eat whether or not they need food if it is available. We say that we can desist from eating even when it's available. We can desist from eating even when it's available and we're hungry. And God knows one of the Rumi Forum specialties is making good food available to the hungry even when we're not hungry. That fasting is a discipline which is shared, of course, among the Abrahamic traditions and among the larger range of human traditions as an example, as an instance, as an exercise in disciplining ourselves. The Torah commands the Israelites in the wilderness to hold a solemn festival on the 10th day of the 7th month, which ends up becoming a festival of fasting. Fasting for 25 hours becomes the tradition. You don't want to make the mistake of short-circuiting a full day, so you start just a little bit before sundown, and you finish a little bit after sundown, and a traditional Jew will fast not 24, but 25 hours. The act of fasting comes to be understood in the Jewish tradition as derived from the problematic of receiving commandments from God, as the Israelites did at the foot of Mount Sinai. And if you remember the story, when Moses came down after 40 days and 40 nights, rather than finding the Israelites waiting with open arms to receive all of these new regulations that God had offered, he found them dancing and singing around a golden calf, a bit of an upset for him. And what follows is 40 days of instruction, and then he has to go back and get a second set of the tablets because he smashed the first in his anguish and his anger. And so the Day of Atonement, as it is called, Yom HaKippur in Hebrew, is understood to mark the 40th day after the beginning of that period of instruction between the bringing down and the smashing of the first set of regulations, the first tablets, and the bringing down of the second tablets. So when the temple stood, there were a whole series of regulations that involved that day, that 10th day of the 7th month, the lead up to which was the entire 30 days of the 6th month, and then the first 10 days of that 7th month, culminating in a Day of Atonement, culminating a period called the Days of Awe. And the outgrowth since the destruction of the temple for the Jewish people is to fast, is to pray, is to spend that day in particularly strong introspection with respect to the year that has passed and the year to come. And of course, one of those who would have visited the temple when it still stood was Jesus of Nazareth. He was a Judean of the 1st century. The time of his most famous visit came not in the 7th month, but in the 1st month, the month of Nisan in the spring, which is when the Passover was being celebrated. And he would have been one among many who made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate that solemn feast, and the tradition that ultimately derived from his title as anointed one, Mashiach, Christos, Christianity, that tradition would develop its sense of the importance of a 40-day period of abstinence. It's called Lent, of course. And just as within the Jewish tradition there are variations on how particular Jews do or don't do, however they do, the Yom Kippur fast, so within Christianity there are variations with respect to Lent, of course. Does it begin on Ash Wednesday or does it begin on Monday? Is it actually 40 days, or as in the Coptic and the Ethiopic and Eritrean churches, is it 55 days? And are there days that are of particular import within that time period? Days, well, everyone agrees that the sixth Sunday, Palm Sunday, is the day when Jesus begins his entrance into Jerusalem that will culminate in his crucifixion and his resurrection. And everyone shares that. How many of you are aware of Spy Wednesday? Oh, thee who live in Washington, D.C., most renowned, of course, for its International Spy Museum. Spy Wednesday is the day that records when Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane and Judas was spying on him. But not every denomination within Christianity marks that day as particular. So we have variations within a theme. We have the same general issue and idea, the idea of introspection, the idea of reflection, the idea of prayer, the idea of atonement, the idea of penitence. All of this is part and parcel of days that in the Christian tradition are said to mirror the 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness, being tempted, at the end of which he began his public ministry, the culmination of which was his crucifixion and resurrection. And Islam, of course, recognizes these predecessor traditions to itself. When in the Quran we read, "You are commanded as others before you have been commanded to keep a sacred fast." The fast during the 9th month of the Muslim calendar, the 9th month being Ramadan, the calendar being a lunar calendar that follows the moon around the earth rather than the earth around the sun, and therefore a 355-day calendar rather than the 365, 366-day calendar that is typically followed in the West, so that Ramadan shifts year by year, 10 or 11 days, vis-a-vis the calendar that we tend to celebrate here. The whole period is a period, on the one hand, of fasting from sunrise to sunset. It's a period of penitence, of patience, of humility, of spirituality, of prayers, of supplications. The word Ramadan comes from an Arabic root, RMD, Ramad. I don't know how to otherwise render it than by saying RMD, which seems to have the meaning of intense heat, of scorched ground. It seems to connect to the original celebration taking place in the heat of the wilderness. It has to do more, however, with the scorching of one's soul in which one engages as one introspects in the course of those 30 days. Readings from the Quran, so that in the course of the entire month, one breaks the Quran into 30 sections. So the juz is the 1/30th section that one reads day by day by day. The various days that are singled out for particular importance culminate with what is called Laylat al-Qadr, the night of the decree or the night of power. And interestingly, flexibility. It is understood, so we've just entered this period, to take place during the last 10 days of Ramadan, the night when the Quran began, specifically the specific night, to be revealed to Muhammad, peace be unto him, one of the odd days after the 20th day of the month, so the 21st or the 23rd or the 25th or the 27th or the 29th, there is that sense of flexibility. It's a period, according to Muhammad, within the Quran and within the Hadith, when the gates of hell are closed and the gates of heaven are opened. It's a period when one should fast and then one should celebrate with one's loved ones, with one's friends, all night long. One should study all night long. One should study and pray. We were talking during dinner about Fethullah Gülen's comment on the relationship between prayer and study. You should study, you should pray, you should feast until you can plainly distinguish a white thread from a black thread. That's when you know the dawn has come and you must resume your fast. You fast and you feast. You end your fast with iftar, with a date, a symbol of abstinence come to its end, a symbol of negative and positive possibility, a symbol of what we need to be and what we can be. And I'm reading from Rumi now, but in English. Not Christian or Jew or Muslim, not Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi, or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the East or the West, not out of the ocean or up from the ground, not natural or ethereal, not composed of elements at all. I do not exist. I'm not an entity in this world or the next, did not descend from Adam and Eve or any origin story. My place is placeless, a trace of the traceless, neither body or soul. I belong to the beloved. This Rumi in the 13th century, a man way ahead of his time, so you can see why the Rumi Forum would have derived its name from him, was all about understanding within the varied particulars, the various threads that make up the rope of humanity, a universalism that makes, when it is fulfilled to its best extent, for a better world. Rumi is one of the key figures in the Muslim mystical tradition known as Sufism. Suf, a word that probably means wool, so it refers to the kind of garment that the Sufis wore to indicate their discipline away from a concern for the material and a focus on the spiritual. As mysticism, Sufism seeks the innermost recesses of God, not only at some time in the future and not in some other place, but in the present, in the here and now. And it is inspired by such thinking that Fethullah Gülen, in fact, who was the honorary president of the Rumi Forum, became himself a servant of the idea of working together. The word that he uses is hizmet, a Turkish word, service, so that it's not just about fasting, it's not just about feasting, it's about going out and in one's life, working together, being together, improving the world together, which is, of course, an idea, as Rumi would say, which is not exclusive to Christians or Jews or Muslims or Hindus, Buddhists or Sufis or Zens or any religion, but to all of us. Thank you very much.